Morning, everyone.
Morning. Morning.
So honored to be here again at Neighborhood, and what a privilege to speak with you folks as you're reflecting on this commitment around taking individual and communal action that accountably dismantles racism and systemic barriers to full inclusion in ourselves and our institutions. Definitely a dense statement, but this intention of dismantling the systems that uphold racism and the barriers that prevent our spaces from becoming, to quote Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a beloved community where all are valued and embraced is certainly a very needed and necessary message in these difficult times. At the same time, we're also grappling with the fact that recent efforts to confront and dismantle racism have triggered a backlash so forceful and intense that it helped put a populist, fascist leader back in office who now threatens America's very democracy. So it is scary times. And I feel every time, I was looking back, every time I've come to Neighborhood over the last few years, I've spoken about difficult times, about a world growing increasingly dangerous. But now, friends, we are faced with something fundamentally different. When our Prime Minister went to Davos and spoke about a rupture taking place globally, he was not wrong. And perhaps even understated how dangerous the times are as violent ideologies of the past and present, whether it's Christian nationalism or white supremacy, fascist ideas, or those old hatrages like anti-Black racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia to aggressive misogyny, all of them coming back into the mainstream in front of our eyes. And as people of faith, people who take part in faith communities and are motivated by spiritual principles which affirm the dignity and value of every human life, this is a time, I would argue, that our ideas and voices are critical to achieving the goal of dismantling racism and systemic barriers. So today, I want to reflect on how we got here, how a newly revived movement to confront racism led to a backlash, and what this might teach us about how to keep the momentum going to end racism in all of our communities. So let's begin by taking a step back in time and remember May 25th, 2020, when the murder of George Floyd was broadcast all over the world. When a planet already reeling from the impact of a global pandemic was stirred into action by a terrible, terrible video, one I will admit I've still not watched nor have any desire to watch, but a terrible video of a citizen being executed callously in the streets of the world's richest country as civilians looked on and pleaded with the officer for mercy. Like in the civil rights movement before, the broadcast images of wanton violence in the streets of an American city stirred the conscience of a nation, and not just one nation, but countries all over the world, including our own. And in the United States, a populace forced to be at home by lockdowns with little opportunity to socialize and mingle channeled that latent energy into the largest protest movement in American history. An estimated 15 to upwards of 26 million people took part in Black Lives Matter marches that summer. Here in Canada, conversations around anti-Black racism, along with a national reckoning around our colonial history of oppression of Indigenous people, spurred similar responses, though not anywhere near the amount of people marching. But beyond being in the streets, this movement played out within organizations as universities, hospitals, bureaucracies, places of worship, and private companies all face demands from employees and stakeholders to acknowledge racism and other forms of oppression that existed within them and make concrete actions around change. And this moment, when you look at it, was truly a radical break. In opinion polling in the US, we saw a record 2/3 of Americans in 2020 said they supported Black Lives Matter. In Canada, if you look between 2019 and 2021, there were also big opinion shifts. In 2019, almost half of Canadians said anti-Black racism was not an issue in the country and was a thing of the past. And 73% said anti-Chinese racism was not an issue in the country. But by 2021, it had changed. Now, when you did the poll 2 years later in 2021, 2/3 of Canadians said they believed both anti-Black racism and anti-Chinese racism were real issues that had to be addressed in society. And as someone who is working in the equity field myself, I can tell you firsthand, for a moment, the amount of work that was available to individuals, and especially racialized individuals, who could speak to questions of anti-racism was unlimited. Entire companies were founded, including my own, with much of our first year and a half, because we started in 2020, was based on DEI-related contracts. Vice President of Equity and Inclusion roles were created overnight at every company. Task forces, town halls, statements, and commissions were launched, and anti-oppression trainings were conducted at a historic rate. And there were real impacts. I know so many Black business owners who over this period were shocked that for the first time in their careers, organizations were actually looking to hire them or give them contracts because they were Black-owned, not despite that fact. And racialized employees suddenly found companies could listen or at least give platform to the complaints and grievances they had spoken about for years. And they were finally acknowledged at the highest and most senior levels. It truly did seem back then like something transformative was happening. But I can say personally, for myself and my business partner Zara, we were also quick to position our business as being a company that did a lot more than DEI work. Because for those of us who'd done this work for a bit of time, we'd seen this before, and we knew in our hearts the moment was not going to last. We'd seen too many cycles where an issue in the media caused a surge of societal focus on issues of racism and oppression, only to have them fizzle out soon after. And this, to some extent, is what happened. We saw that in opinion polling in Canada and America. In Canada, over the last few years, we've seen a massive shift where people's focus on racism, it's gone to being one of the least important issues named, and more racist and bigoted views on issues of immigration have steadily increased. In the US, by as early as 2023, there was a massive drop in support for Black Lives Matter as a movement, and now this year, a whopping 75% of Americans said the work that happened after George Floyd had not had any positive impact on the lives of Black Americans. So public support everywhere for this work has gone down, just as many of those DEI positions have been canceled in organizations and equity statements removed from corporate websites. So what happened, friends? And what can we learn? Well, first and foremost, individuals who hold bigoted beliefs or ideologically didn't like identity politics or anti-racism work fought back. And many billionaires and highly wealthy individuals came together, specifically in the US, to organize anti-DEI campaigns, and that pushback expanded across the world. So I want to be clear, this isn't a story primarily about the failures of those of us who wanted to confront racism and deconstruct it. It's a story of a well-funded counter-movement that has gone on attack. But, that being said, we also have to be honest in that mistakes and missteps by anti-racism activists and champions also led to the failure of the movement to achieve long-lasting wins and helped make it easier for that backlash to take place. And it's worth mentioning some of those lessons as we think about how do we pick up the next stage in this struggle. So let me quickly share a few lessons. Lesson number one, we need to make our movement more invitational and inclusive. So I've been doing anti-racism training since I was 18 years old. And one of the biggest issues with this field, and I'll admit it as someone who's been a part of it, is that the trainings are not very successful. The research evidence now shows quite clearly that these trainings don't lead to changes many times in organizational cultures or beliefs. But despite that, running anti-racism training is the first thing every organization does when the issue is raised. But running training sessions that don't change people's minds, but simply reinforce the ideas of the true believers, may be satisfying, but is not very effective. To truly change society, you have to change the minds of folks who don't agree with you. That's how you move the needle. But the problem is, rarely do you change people's minds by lecturing them, by wagging your finger at them, by telling them how ignorant they are. Actually, doing that is probably the most effective way to turn them against you. But despite this simple fact, right, that we all would know intuitively, so much of the training, discourse, and ideas that were platformed during the George Floyd moment did just that. They came from an arrogance that said, look, people's views are changing, society is becoming more inclusive, and if you're not on board, well, you're a dinosaur, and you better join us before you go extinct. And it took concepts from the social sciences that were very complicated and at times subjective and treated them like they were gospel truth, like dogma. And if you dared question them, you were called out. And listen, I believe in theories of anti-oppression and anti-racism, and I think training can be useful. But training alone can't change an organization. And when you're dealing with changing people's minds, the best a training session can do is introduce them to a new perspective and invite them to learn more and maybe connect some of what they heard to their own experience. And unfortunately, many anti-racism trainings didn't do that. And this brings to the other issue of being invitational. Many approaches to talking about identity politics get so focused on one group's particular struggle that they don't do necessarily a great job of connecting those specific concerns to the larger struggle for human emancipation. Sometimes this work can turn into a ranking or a competition around oppression, making some barriers that some folks face seem more important than others. And this, I believe, is why so many young men, particularly young straight men, many who are white, but also young men of color, have increasingly felt that the progressive movement is not for them. That the work around anti-racism and oppression ignored their own suffering and their own struggles, but just named them as oppressors. And so they ended up finding validation, going online, finding these online influencers who told them, oh, guess what? It's actually women's movements or anti-racist movements or progressive movements that aren't for you. And they're actually against you. And so we've seen this growing trend of conservatism globally among young men who just don't feel movements for social justice care about them or center their concerns. And it's imperative then that movements for racial justice do the intellectual work to connect the fight for racial justice to the larger struggle for flourishing for all human beings. And to make it clear, all of our liberation is interconnected. And it's not about winning victories for one marginalized community at the expense of another community. And we can only do that through inviting people into dialogue, not abandoning our values, but also not preaching them as dogma. And this connects to a second lesson that I've observed around class, that anti-racism work in the last decade or so has had a real class blind spot. And maybe not in the way you'd think. It wasn't just that contemporary conversations about anti-racism sometimes missed the linkages to class struggle. It's also the reality that anti-racist ideas, concepts, and language became very much entrenched in the academic language and beliefs of upper middle class, highly educated folks. And in America, we saw that after 2020, there were many studies I saw where white educated Americans were much more likely to say they supported theoretical concepts about structural racism than Black Americans were, than racialized Americans were. And this becomes a problem as our society has been segregated and separated more and more along class and education lines. And so when anti-racism began to seem like a cultural movement of the privileged and educated, when it was full of complex language that excluded many, it started to become associated as a belief of the powerful and the privileged. It started to feel at times like a paternalistic way for upper middle class folks to lecture working class people about their beliefs, about the language they used, all while the cost of living was going up massively and making life harder for working class folks. And so people started to ask, if you progressive folks care about justice so much, How come you seem fine with society always getting better for you and worse for me? How can you think the system is so bad, yet profit off from it so much? And finally, a third lesson that came from this period is that the work is really hard. And having been there at the front lines, sometimes it felt like DEI work that came out after 2020 was set up to fail. Right? All of these organizations made great statements, and the leaders stood up and put their hand on their heart and committed to solve racism, to change this embedded social issue that had been plaguing society for hundreds of years. And then they dedicated 1 or 2 staff to it and a tiny budget. I would always say, when big companies decide to do things that are important to them, major changes, like for example, moving an organization to a new software platform, they will spend millions and millions of dollars on change management. Yet, purging an organization of racism, doing something that's way more complicated, got pennies. And not surprisingly, lots of promises were made and people did not see progress. In 2020, you may remember this, over 500 Canadian companies, all the big ones on Bay Street, signed up to the Black North targets around hiring Black staff and Black representation in leadership. Few have achieved those goals, which were modest even then. And in 2025, last year, when the Globe and Mail reached out to those 500 companies to ask about their progress, only 16% of them even bothered to respond. It was clear that these goals were not going to be met anytime soon. So for many champions of racial justice, it felt like we only had a runway of a few years to undo hundreds of years of systemic racism, usually with few resources. And then when the progress just got started, people said, well, you didn't change anything. We've got a new corporate priority, moving on. Exclusive language, blind spots on class, and unrealistic expectations with few resources. All of this helped to undermine the enthusiasm of that 2020 moment. Simultaneously, many of those folks who felt excluded in the anti-racism trainings, who felt their struggles were ignored by identity politics, who became disheartened by the lack of progress, all the language, and the lack of things happening, they started to find homes online. They started to coalesce around thinkers like the Jordan Petersons of the world and began to become part of this anti-DEI reaction that helped propel Donald Trump back to office. Okay, so if those are some of the lessons, well then what is our response? Because the struggle is not over, the work is not done. Well, the first thing I would ask you all to consider as you discuss this commitment to end racism is to be conscious of ensuring your language demonstrating how that you use demonstrates how anti-racism connects to larger struggles for human justice and freedom for all. And I'd say this is where language from faith traditions is so critical. The political far right is very effective in part because it uses both secular and faith-based language to support their ideas. Anti-racism movements today too often ignore faith-based arguments, even if ideas like universal human rights and combating racism have origins in spiritual frameworks and were sustained in the past by movements led by people of faith. And so today we need more spiritual communities speaking courageously in public about their beliefs, reminding the general public that faith is a contested area and there are many, many folks whose faith leads them to socially inclusive worldviews. And a great way to do this, that you're already doing well at Neighborhood, is through interfaith work. It's so powerful when people can see groups working across faith backgrounds to speak out against racism, to make it clear there are universal values shared across faiths about equality and human dignity. Using faith-based language to complement secular anti-racist beliefs can also make the work around anti-racism more accessible. As I mentioned, we need to be aware of our class biases, of our education biases, and understand if people can't understand our ideas, if we can't explain racism and systemic oppression in ways that are relatable and intuitive to people, It's easy for them to write off those ideas as just woke preaching. We also need to invest in this work, both individually and as organizations, and understand that all of us are impacted by biases and stereotypes. All of our organizations can use work to better stand up and be more effective at purging them of racism. But this work will take time and attention, and we have to stop thinking that a one-time training, one workshop is progress. Training can be helpful, sure, but ridding institutions of racist practices can be a long and onerous journey, and we need to truly invest in it and create new practices which will reinforce over and over again for years into the future. And it won't be easy. And it cannot just be outsourced to a single person or a smaller committee. It must be shared work across organizations. Friends, I'm not hopeless. In the shock of what we're seeing right now on our TVs every day, at home and abroad, I believe there is a silver lining. It's forcing us as Canadians to not be so naive as to think, oh, these issues could never happen here. Nor hopefully are we no longer naive enough to still believe that good people can just sit back, and wait for all the racist people to pass on, because the newer generation is just naturally so progressive and open-minded. That's not true. We have to make the case for anti-racism with the new generation, just as previous generations did for us before. We need to reach out to those people, like those young men who are struggling, who feel excluded, who feel like society is stacked against them, and show them that we have compassion for their suffering, and show them that our movement is one for all human beings. But also being clear that the answer to the isolation and anger they're feeling is not, as some of those online voices would tell them, to take out that frustration on women, on newcomers, on immigrants, or others. The answer for all who are feeling excluded right now is to join together in a movement that wants to transform society for all, that wants to speak to the root causes in our economy and our democracy that have allowed inequality to spread so widely. And this means anti-racism champions need to expand their ability to communicate outside of those who just share the same academic background and existing politics, and move from lecturing and calling out to inviting in. And embrace that long-term and sometimes thankless work of understanding other people's positions and perspectives and trying to find common ground where possible. But in closing, I'd say, who better to help us with this work than you folks as Unitarians? Already you are a big tent faith. You have deep expertise in helping people with very different beliefs find a place in one community. And we need a lot more of that in the world. And I can't even claim to fully understand how you all do it, but I know the expertise your tradition has gained in knitting diverse ideas and positions together is something the modern anti-racist movement needs badly. Because we need to grow this movement and grow it in unexpected places. So please, Unitarians, don't turn inwards at this time. As that song says, that little light you have, that little light of inclusion, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, even in the darkness. As you continue to do that internal work, we need to see that light. We need new voices speaking in wider society to give hope to folks who aren't feeling it right now. We need expanded leadership and more thoughtful narratives in the movement to end racism. So, as you grapple with this call over the coming weeks, remember that this city, this country, needs you right now. And I know many people in this congregation already do so much around issues of social justice and anti-racism. But friends, just let me say, the hour is late. And for those of us who want to see an end to racism, we actually need today to redouble our efforts to respond to the moment. I believe truth, justice, and love will win out in the end, but only if we are able to overcome our differences and face the challenges of our times together. Thank you.